Hi students, we're back. And in this section we're going to be talking about the field of behavior modification. So we've been kind of alluding to this field and talking about behaviors, but let's kind of pinpoint it and talk about how behavior modification differs potentially from other fields in psychology. So behavior modification is a field of psychology, and the focus of this field is on analyzing and modifying behaviors. So by analyzing, we're looking at trying to describe the behaviors. How are they occurring within the environment? What are the antecedents? What are the consequences for the behavior? And focusing on what happens before and after, and using the environment to change the behavior. So the field focuses very much on principles of learning for changes of behavior. So we're going to be talking about classical conditioning, the work of Pavlov, operant conditioning, reinforcement, punishment, shaping, fading. We're using these principles, and these are time-tested, research-based principles, but we're looking at behavioral principles, learning principles as a basis for change. Now, one of the things that I think is very positive about the field is the focus is on changing the behaviors rather than changing the person. Within behavior modification, because we avoid using labels, we are focusing on how do we change the environment that the person is living in and set the person up for being successful in their environment rather than changing the individual. And so if we can focus on the behavior rather than on the person, that can be very positive. Because sometimes when you focus on changing the person, we need to change this person. We need to give this person stronger willpower. We need to make this person change. That implies that there's really something wrong with the person. In behavior modification, we're really focused on changing the behaviors of the person. So if we change their behaviors, they're going to be more successful in their environment. So behavior modification has certain characteristics. We're going to talk about the characteristics of the field, and I'm going to often just abbreviate our field as BMod because that is a pretty standard way to abbreviate it. So as we mentioned, the field tends to focus on behaviors. So the focus is on behavior rather than on changing the person. Let's change the behavior. And oftentimes, the goal is to identify a target behavior. Now, that is the behavior to be measured and to be changed. When we do your behavior change project, you're going to have to identify what the target behavior is. What is the behavior you want to measure and change? Is that going to be hand washing behavior? Is that going to be playing video games? Is that going to be sleeping? Is that going to be studying? That is the target behavior. And as we mentioned, oftentimes we will think about these target behaviors in terms of an excess, some kind of a target we want to decrease. This is something that we're doing too much of, right? So that might be playing video games, it might be smoking, it might be consuming sugar. This is something we want to decrease. Or it might be a behavioral deficit, some kind of a target we want to increase. So this could be hand washing behavior, it could be sleeping, it could be exercising. These are the things that we want to do more of. Another characteristic of behavior modification is the focus on measuring behavior change across time. So what you're going to see in your project and what you're going to see as we talk about research in behavior modification is that there is this emphasis on measuring behavior before we do something. So we're going to always collect a baseline, what is originally happening, during some kind of an intervention, when we have a treatment, when we change the environment, and then after the intervention, what happens when the environment goes back to the way that it normally was before the intervention. So we're going to be looking to see what happens with the behavior across these different time frames. So from before we do something, what's normally happening, during some kind of an intervention, and then after. But the focus is on looking at changes across time. And we're really measuring behavior, not to just say, well, I think that I improved this behavior. I think I am studying more. I think I am sleeping more. No, we're going to actually have documented evidence because we're going to be tracking how much sleep are we doing beforehand, how much sleep are we doing during the treatment, and then how much sleep are we doing after. Another characteristic of behavior modification is that treatment involves changing the environment or the stimuli here. So we're going to be focused on changing antecedents and changing consequences, what happens before the behavior and then what happens after. But this is really kind of different from other fields in psychology. So the focus is very much on the here and now, and there's a de-emphasis on the past. So we're not going to be focusing on, well, what happened during your childhood, what happened when you were growing up, how did these behaviors start in the past. We're going to be focusing on what's going on right now and what can we do to change what's going on right now so that the individual is able to engage in more positive behaviors. So we're going to change the environment. We're going to focus on the antecedents. Remember, we talked about these things. These are the things that happen before the behavior, the stimuli, the trigger, the environment, and then the consequences. What happens after the behavior? Is the behavior reinforced or is the behavior punished? But the focus is on now and not necessarily on what happened in the person or the client's past. Now, as we mentioned, the whole area of behavior modification is focused on behavioral learning principles and research. So we're going to be spending time talking about classical Pavlovian conditioning as well as operant conditioning, reinforcers and punishers, because that's what the field is based on. And there's a lot of research to support the effectiveness of these practices. Behavior modification also is very focused on precise description of the procedures. So in doing your behavior modification, behavior change project, the whole idea is that we very carefully describe our operational definitions and we track what we are doing. When we are doing research in this field, we want to be very clear about what was done so that it's easy for people to replicate the process, the procedure. So we have to document, how did we measure the behavior during the baseline phase? How did we measure it during any kind of treatment? How are we measuring it after treatment? We have to be very clear and take precise notes so that someone else can replicate our work. Another characteristic of behavior modification is that the treatment is implemented by people in everyday life. Again, I think this is one of the major advantages of this field. The idea is that once you know about these principles, you can use them in your everyday life. Once teachers know about these principles, they can use them working in their classes. Once therapists know about these principles, they can use them with their clients. But again, the idea is that once you understand some of the basic principles, you can use them. And the goal is that anybody who has access to this information can use these methods successfully. So anyone can use them once they know the methods. So again, it's important to understand how the methods work, but the goal isn't that you have to get a doctorate degree or a master's degree in behavior modification to be able to use this. The idea is that once you know something about this, you can take it and run with it. You can use it in your everyday life. Another goal of behavior modification is that we have to demonstrate that the treatment is what had an effect on the change in behavior. So if you want to think about this, it's kind of similar to what we do in research studies, specifically in experiments. We're trying to make sure that what we saw in terms of the treatment, whatever we decided to do, that's what changed the behavior and not something else. So we're really, as we're tracking down what's happening within a behavior change project, we're trying to do everything possible to rule out other explanations for our results, what we see happening with the behavior. And that shows us validity, that the change that we made, the treatment that we made affected the behavior and not something else. The last characteristic we're going to talk about here is accountability for all involved. So typically behavior modification kinds of projects don't just involve a therapist working with a client. They often involve a whole team of people collaborating together. So it could include the behavior modifier, which might be the therapist. It would include the client. It might include the family members. If this were happening for a child in a school system, it would likely involve the teachers. It might involve some kind of a classroom aide. But the idea here is that it's not just one person working on this, it's a whole team of individuals coming together and being responsible for the change in behavior. And I think that that's a very positive characteristic of behavior modification. So it's it's not just one person, it's a lot of people helping to support and move towards behavior change. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is some popular misconceptions about behavior modification. Behavior modification has been around since the 1950s and the 1960s, and across time it's kind of been popular and then less popular, and a lot of people have ideas about what happens in behavior modifications, but to some extent this can be some of the ideas that they have are incorrect. So let's start off with these misconceptions. We're going to talk about what they are, and throughout the term you're going to see evidence that these are not the case. So people incorrectly believe the following things about behavior modification. One thing they believe is that it works in lab settings but not in the real world. Now, I hope what you're going to see when we do this behavior change project is that behavior modification is very focused on seeing behavior change in the real world. We're not doing experiments in a lab. We are oftentimes working with real people in real world settings. We're working with children in classrooms. We're working with older adults in assisted living facilities. We're working with athletes out on the track. Behavior modification is very focused on making changes in the real world, because if you change something in the lab, that doesn't mean you're going to see it happening in the real world. So oftentimes behavior modification actually is happening in the real world. Now, some people believe that behavior modification involves some kind of drug therapy, and nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, purists, people that only focus on behavior modification, think that behavior modification is much more effective for a lot of kinds of psychological disorders compared to different kinds of drug therapy. So if we can change the behavior, the idea is that we don't need to use drugs to change things like depression or change things like anxiety disorders. If we can change their behaviors, the drug therapy isn't needed. So behavior modification doesn't involve drug therapy. Now, that's not to say that a therapist might decide to combine drug therapy in addition to behavior modification, and that would kind of be the best of both worlds. But in and of itself, behavior modification does not involve using drugs. So some people believe that behavior modification changes the symptoms and the behaviors, but doesn't get to the underlying cause or root of the behavior. And I think this is assuming that we're focusing on just those overt kinds of behaviors and not the covert behaviors. But what we're going to see is that we can change some of those covert behaviors as well. And if we change those, then we're engaging in changing the behaviors as well as oftentimes the cause or the root of the behavior. Now, some people believe that behavior modification works for simple problems with children and animals, but it doesn't work for complex issues with adults like anxiety and depression. And what you're going to see is that's simply not the case. There is a lot of research with children and animals, but there is also a lot of research with adults with different kinds of psychological disorders, with anxiety, with depression, and same principles work in both sets of populations. Some people believe it focuses on behavior, not feelings or thoughts. Well, again, we've talked about that, and the behaviors can be either overt or covert. And so the covert would include these things like feelings and thoughts. And so obviously behavior modification can focus on those things as well. Now, some people would say it's outdated, it's not used often anymore, and that's just simply not true. There's a lot of behavior modification being used in many different fields, and in many circumstances it is considered the best, most research supported approach to treating some kind of behavior change. And we're going to talk about that more in our next set of videos as we see the different areas where behavior modification is used. Well, some people think that rewards are bribery. And so reinforcing somebody for engaging in a behavior is bribing them. Well, I suppose that is one way to look at it, but if that's the case, then much of our society is based on bribery, because we are rewarded for lots of behaviors. When you go to your job, you get a paycheck. When you study for an exam, you're going to get a grade. I don't typically think about a paycheck and a good grade as being bribery, but many people think that rewards are bribery, and it's not the case. It's just that we have consequences in our environment, and those consequences affect our behavior. Well, Another misconception is that punishment is unethical and it leads to increases in behavior. Now, I think some of this comes from the idea that we're looking at certain kinds of punishment. So we will talk about punishment. We will talk about physical punishment and spanking. And I think some people believe that that is unethical and does lead to increases in behavior. And we will certainly talk about that. But punishment is a much broader concept. And it doesn't necessarily have to be physical punishment. We have lots of punishers in our environment all the time. If we exceed the speed limit in our car and we get a ticket, that's a punisher. If we break the law and we go to jail, that's a punisher. We have punishments built into our society. Another way to think about them is punishment is a consequence. And so the idea is, are all these consequences unethical? I think we will look at principles of behavior modification and see when punishment works and when it doesn't work. All right, so we're going to end our video here, and I will see you next time.